The rain came down like judgment. Alessandro Moretti stood at the tall windows of his study, a glass of untouched scotch sweating in his hand, and watched lightning fork over the black water of Lake Michigan. Thunder followed a heartbeat later, rattling the leaded panes of a house that had buried 3 generations of Moretti men, and would, if God or the Drago family had anything to say about it, eventually bury him too. He liked storms. They matched something in him that never settled, some restless current running under his skin that no amount of money or power or fear could quiet. His father used to say that a Moretti man was born angry and died angrier, and that the only mercy was choosing what to be angry about. Tonight, Alessandro was angry about nothing in particular, which was its own kind of danger. He heard the alarm chirp on his phone before he heard anything outside. A motion sensor along the south perimeter wall, the one that ran along the tree line where the property dropped toward the old service road. Deer, usually. Sometimes a fox. Once, memorably, a drunk kid from the yacht club who'd wandered onto Moretti land and lived to regret it. He almost ignored it, almost let Enzo or one of the nightmen handle it the way he was supposed to, the way a man with $40 million of security infrastructure was allowed to ignore a blinking dot on a screen. Instead, he picked up the handheld radio from his desk and walked out onto the terrace himself, because some instinct older than reason told him to. The rain hit him like a wall. He didn't flinch. He had stood in worse rain than this, in worse places than this, with worse things than a Chicago thunderstorm bearing down on him. He crossed the flagstones with the unhurried, contained stride of a man who had never once in his life needed to run toward danger, because danger generally had the good sense to come find him. That was when he saw her. She was lying at the edge of the drive where the gravel met the grass, a pale shape against the dark ground. Her dress, was it a dress, or a slip, or a nightgown? He couldn't tell in the strobing dark, plastered to her body by the rain. Her hair was black and matted across her face. One arm was flung out above her head as if she'd been reaching for something when she fell, and the other was curled protectively, instinctively, around the swell of her stomach. Alessandro had seen a great many bodies in his life. He had made a great many of them. He knew, in the half-second before his mind caught up with his eyes, the terrible economy of a person who was dead versus a person who was merely dying. She was breathing, shallow, but breathing. "Enzo," he said into the radio, already moving, already on his knees in the mud beside her, rain sluicing down the back of his ruined $3,000 shirt. "Get Dr. Faro, now, and clear the west wing. Boss, now, Enzo." He didn't wait for the response. He was looking at her face, young, maybe late 20s, a face that under different circumstances would have been extraordinary. All fine bones and a mouth made for arguments, and at the blood, thin and pink and rain-diluted, tracking from somewhere in her hairline down along her jaw. Her lips were the colour of ash. "Can you hear me?" He touched her throat, found a pulse, too fast, too thin. "Hey, look at me." Her eyelids fluttered. For a moment, just a moment, her eyes opened, and he found himself looking into a colour he would spend an embarrassing amount of time later trying to name. Not blue, not grey, something in between, like the lake at dusk. "Please," she whispered. It was barely a shape of a word, more breath than sound. "The baby." And then she was gone again, slack in his arms, and Alessandro Moretti, A man who did not carry things that were not his, who did not involve himself in problems that could not be solved with money or violence, who had built an empire specifically so that he would never again have to depend on the mercy of anyone, lifted a stranger and her unborn child off the wet gravel and carried her into his house like she already belonged there. He didn't examine in that moment why it felt like she did. The mansion came alive around him the way it always did in a crisis, silent and fast, men appearing from doorways with weapons half drawn, and then holstering them at the sight of their boss, soaked to the bone, with a pregnant, unconscious woman in his arms. Enzo Marchetti, his consigliere and the closest thing he had to a brother, met him at the base of the grand staircase with a face carved from concern and confusion in equal measure. "Who is she?" "I don't know," Alessandro said, already climbing. "Get Faro up here and find out how the hell she got past 3 motion sensors and a mile of woods in 6-inch heels without anyone seeing her." "You think somebody dropped her?" "I think," Alessandro said, laying her down on the bed in the West Wing guest suite with a gentleness that would have startled anyone who knew him, "that I'm going to find out." He stood back as the doctor arrived, breathless, black bag in hand, and began the brisk, practiced work of triage: pulse, pupils, the careful press of fingers along her skull where the blood had come from, a check of her belly that made Alessandro's jaw tighten in a way he didn't examine either. "She's roughly 7 months along," Faro said without looking up. "Baby's heart rate is strong, thank God. She's got a laceration on her scalp, mild concussion probably, exposure, and she's dehydrated. Whatever happened to her, she's lucky. Another hour out there, and I don't know that I could say the same." "Will she wake up?" "Should. Soon, probably. Head wounds like this, sometimes there's what?" Faro finally looked up at him, and something in Alessandro's expression made the older man choose his next words carefully. "Sometimes there's memory loss. Temporary, usually, but I've seen it stick." Alessandro looked down at the woman on the bed. Stranger, wounded, cradling even in unconsciousness the small mound of her stomach, as though her body knew to protect that one thing above all others, above her own life, and felt something shift inside his chest that he did not have a name for yet, and would resist naming for a long time after. "Then we wait," he said, "until she remembers who she is." He did not say the other thought that came, unbidden, close behind it, that until she remembered, she was his. Not because he wanted to possess her, not yet, but because a man like Alessandro Moretti did not open his doors for anyone, and having done so, even by accident, even for a stranger the storm had washed onto his land, he was not now inclined to let her go. She woke to the smell of rain, still clinging to the open window, and the specific, deep ache of a body that had been through something it didn't remember. For a long moment she simply lay still, cataloguing sensations the way a person does when they aren't sure yet whether moving will hurt. Soft sheets, weight against her ribs, a hand, she realized after a beat, her own hand, resting protectively over the curve of her stomach. Pain in her head, dull and insistent, like a held note, and nothing else. No name, no face to put to the ache in her chest. No thread to pull that led backward into a life. She sat up too fast, and the room tilted, and a voice, low, controlled, faintly accented in a way she couldn't place, said, "Slowly." She turned and found him sitting in a chair pulled close to the bed, one ankle crossed over his knee, forearms resting on the chair's arms, in a posture of perfect, unhurried stillness. He was the kind of handsome that read as a warning rather than an invitation. Dark hair, a jaw that looked like it had never once relaxed, eyes so dark they swallowed the light instead of reflecting it. He wore a black shirt, sleeves rolled to the forearm, and he watched her with the focused patience of a man who had learned a long time ago that the person who spoke first in a negotiation usually lost it. "Who are you?" she asked. Her voice came out cracked, unfamiliar even to her own ears. "That's the question I was going to ask you." He didn't move from the chair, though she could feel the attention in him like a physical thing, a searchlight trained entirely on her face. "You collapsed outside my home last night, in the middle of a storm. 7 months pregnant, with a head wound and no identification. Do you remember any of that?" She opened her mouth to answer and found nothing. A door she reached for that simply wasn't there. Panic moved through her, quick and cold. "I don't remember," she said. "I don't remember anything. My name, I don't—" Her hand tightened over her stomach, as though the baby were the only fact left in the world she could hold on to. "Is the baby okay? Please, tell me the baby's okay." "The baby's fine." Something in his voice gentled, almost imperceptibly, at her fear. "Strong heartbeat, according to my doctor. You, less so. But you'll live." "Your doctor? Where am I?" "My home." He finally rose, and even that small movement carried a kind of contained danger, like watching a large predator decide not to attack. He crossed to the window and looked out at the grey morning as if the storm had personally offended him by ending. "Just outside Chicago. My name is Alessandro Moretti, and before you ask, no, I don't know who you are, and no, I don't know how you ended up on my lawn. But I intend to find out." Something about the way he said "intend" made the hair rise on her arms. She studied him, the expensive, ruined shirt someone had apparently not bothered to replace, the faint shadow of stubble, the eyes that tracked her like she was a puzzle he hadn't decided yet whether he wanted solved or simply owned. "You could call the police," she said carefully. "Report a missing person. That would probably be faster." His mouth curved, not quite a smile. "I don't call the police." "Why not?" "Because men like me don't invite that kind of attention into our homes." He turned to look at her fully then, and the directness of his gaze made her pulse trip in a way that had nothing to do with fear, though fear was in the mix too, tangled up with something else she didn't have a name for, any more than she had a name for herself. "You're safe here. That's all you need to understand right now. Safer than wherever you were running from, judging by the state you were in when you fell." "How do you know I was running?" "Because women who aren't running don't end up alone in the woods at midnight in a thunderstorm, 7 months pregnant, with a head wound that looks like it came from something a great deal more deliberate than a fall." He said it flatly, a statement of fact rather than an accusation, and she felt the ground of her non-existent memory shift under that new, terrible possibility. Someone had hurt her. Someone had hurt her badly enough that she'd run through a storm, alone, pregnant, and collapsed rather than stop. "I don't remember," she said again, and this time her voice broke on it, and to her own surprise, tears came. Not delicate, cinematic tears, but the raw, frightened kind. The kind that came from a body that understood terror even when the mind attached to it had lost every reference point. I don't remember anything. I don't know my own name. I don't know if someone's looking for me, or if someone did this to me, or—" She stopped, because he had crossed the room and was sitting on the edge of the bed, close enough that she could feel the heat of him, close enough that some old animal part of her registered danger and shelter as the same thing at the same time. He didn't touch her. He simply sat there, solid and still, and said, in a voice that had dropped all its earlier coolness, "Then we'll give you a name until you remember your own." She wiped at her face, embarrassed, furious at herself for crying in front of a stranger, however kind that stranger's stillness had briefly seemed. What? Like a dog? That got the ghost of a real smile out of him, quick, gone almost before it arrived, but she'd seen it. Like a woman who fell out of a storm and into my life uninvited. He considered her for a moment. Rain. Rain, she repeated, testing the shape of it in her mouth. It didn't feel like her. Nothing felt like her. But it was something to hold on to in a life that currently held nothing else. All right. Rain. Rain, he said again, like he was filing it away. And something about the way he said it, proprietary, deliberate, sent a shiver down her spine that she chose, for now, not to examine. "And you?" she said. "Alessandro Moretti. What are you?" His dark eyes held hers, unblinking, and when he answered, his voice was very quiet and very sure. "I'm the man who's going to keep you alive until we find out who wants you dead." By the second day, Rain had learnt the shape of the house, if not the shape of her own life. It was enormous, a lakeside estate of grey stone and dark wood, the kind of old money architecture that had been built to intimidate before it had ever been built to shelter. Every hallway seemed to lead to another hallway. Every window looked out over grounds so vast and so carefully maintained that they resembled something closer to a private park than a backyard. And everywhere, quietly, unmistakably, there were men. They didn't wear uniforms, they didn't carry their weapons where she could see them, mostly. But she had lived, however briefly, however memoryless, long enough in this house to recognize the particular economy of movement in men who were paid to notice threats before threats noticed them. They watched the doors. They watched the windows. They watched her, when they thought she wasn't looking, with expressions she couldn't read and didn't entirely trust. "You're staring at Marco," said a voice from the doorway of the sunroom where she'd been sitting, wrapped in a cardigan someone had produced from somewhere, watching the lake churn grey and restless beyond the glass. "He'll take that as an invitation to flirt. Don't encourage him. He's insufferable when he's encouraged." She turned to find a woman leaning in the doorway, dark-haired, sharp-eyed, dressed in the kind of effortlessly expensive clothes that suggested either old money or very good taste applied to new money. She had a face built for reading rooms, and right now she was reading Rain, with an intensity that felt almost proprietary. "I'm Sophia," the woman said, coming to sit across from her. "Alessandro's cousin. Well, cousin isn't quite right, but it's close enough for a house like this. I run point on some of the family's legitimate interests, the parts you can put on a business card." "Rain," she said, because it was the only name she had to offer, and it felt strange even saying it, like borrowing someone else's coat. "I know. Alessandro told me." Sophia's gaze dropped briefly to the swell of Rain's stomach, and something crossed her face. Not unkindness, but a kind of careful calculation that Rain was beginning to recognize as the house's default expression. "How are you feeling?" Confused, Rain admitted. Grateful. Terrified, if I'm honest. I don't know how to be a person who doesn't know she's a person. Sophia's mouth softened. That sounds exhausting. It is. Rain wrapped her arms tighter around herself. Can I ask you something? And I want an honest answer, not whatever version of the truth this house likes to tell people. I'll do my best. What is he, Alessandro, really? I've gathered, she gestured vaguely at the house, the men in the hallways, the careful, watchful quiet of the whole estate, that this isn't just money. This is something else. Sophia was quiet for a long moment, weighing something. When she finally spoke, her voice had dropped, gone careful and low, the tone of someone choosing to trust a stranger with information that could be dangerous in the wrong hands. The Morettis have been in Chicago for 4 generations, she said. You want the sanitized version? They're in real estate, shipping, hospitality. You want the truth? Alessandro runs one of the last real families left in this city, what used to be called, a long time ago, the Mafia. He doesn't love the word. Nobody in this house says it out loud if they can help it. But that's what it is. Rain absorbed that the way she'd absorbed everything else since waking, with a kind of numb, floating shock, information landing on a mind with nothing solid underneath it to catch on. And he just brought a stranger into his home, knowing that, knowing what kind of danger that could mean for a man like him. That's what surprised me too, Sophia admitted. Alessandro doesn't do sentiment. He didn't get where he is by being soft. I've seen him walk past car accidents without slowing down because it wasn't his problem to solve. She studied Rain again, that same careful, cataloguing look. But he carried you in himself. Sat with Pharaoh the whole night, making sure you'd wake up. Hasn't left the house since you got here, which, trust me, for a man who's usually 3 cities at once, that's not nothing. Something in Rain's chest twisted, warm and unwelcome, at the thought of him sitting with her through the night, and she pushed it down, because a woman with no name and no past had no business feeling anything for the dangerous, magnetic stranger who'd pulled her out of the mud. Why would he do that? She asked. He doesn't know me. No, Sophia agreed, but I think that's exactly why. Before Rain could ask what that meant, the door opened and Alessandro himself stepped through, dressed now in a dark suit that fit him like a second skin, his phone in one hand, his expression already sharpening at the sight of the 2 women together. Sophia, he said, I need the Delacroix numbers by 5. They're on your desk. Sophia rose, unhurried, and paused beside him on her way out, low enough that Rain wasn't sure she was meant to hear it. Be careful with this one, Sandro. I mean that as a friend. I'm always careful, he said. No, Sophia said, and there was something almost fond in it. You really aren't. Not about the things you've decided are yours. She left. Alessandro watched her go, then turned his attention fully to Rain, and the room seemed to contract around the weight of it, the way it always did when he looked at her, like she was the only fixed point in a house full of moving pieces. Pharaoh wants to run more tests, he said. Blood work, an ultrasound. Make sure the baby's development is on track, given the trauma. He paused. I want you to have the best care available, whatever that costs. I can't pay you back for any of this, Rain said. I don't even know if I have money. I don't know anything. I didn't ask you to pay me back. His voice was quiet, and something in it made her look up and hold his gaze, dark and unreadable, and entirely too interested. I asked Pharaoh to take care of you because you're in my house, and nothing in my house goes without care. That's not charity, Rain. That's how I run things. Is that supposed to be reassuring? It's supposed to be true. He held her eyes a beat longer than necessary, something unspoken moving behind the dark of them. And then he turned toward the door. Rest today. Tomorrow, we start finding out who you are. He left before she could answer, and she sat alone in the sunroom with her hand pressed to her stomach, feeling the baby shift beneath her palm, and thought, with a clarity that startled her, given how little else in her mind held any shape at all, that whoever she had been before the storm, she had never in her life met a man like Alessandro Moretti. And some reckless, unremembered part of her wanted very badly to know why that felt like something she already understood. The Onyx was the kind of club that didn't advertise, didn't need a sign, and turned away more money at the door than most establishments made in a year. It occupied 3 floors of a converted warehouse on the near west side, and it belonged, like a great many things in that part of the city, to Alessandro Moretti. He didn't often go there in person anymore. He'd built the club a decade ago as a young man hungry to prove something, and now it ran itself, a machine of velvet ropes and bottle service, and the particular alchemy of money and music that made people forget for a few hours exactly how dangerous the man who owned the building really was. But tonight he needed the noise. He needed to be somewhere that wasn't his house, wasn't full of the particular silence that had settled over the West Wing since a woman with no name had started occupying his thoughts more thoroughly than any war with the Dragos ever had. "You look like a man who wants to hit something," Enzo said, sliding into the booth across from him with 2 glasses of the good Scotch, the kind reserved for the owner's table. "I look like a man running a business," Alessandro said. "You look," Enzo said, unbothered, "like a man who hasn't slept in 2 days because he's too busy standing guard outside a guest suite." Alessandro didn't dignify that with a response, which was, in the language the two of them had built over 20 years of friendship, as good as a confession. "We got nothing on facial recognition," Enzo continued, dropping his voice below the baseline, thudding through the floor. "No hits in any database I can access, which either means she's got no criminal history and no professional photo ID anywhere, or somebody with real money scrubbed her from every system that matters. I'm leaning toward the second one." "Why?" "Because the dress she was wearing cost more than most people's cars, Sandro. Because whoever did that to her head knew exactly how hard to hit without killing her, which takes training, not rage. And because in 6 years of doing this job for you, I have never once seen a woman just fall out of the sky into your life without somebody wanting something from it." Alessandro turned his glass slowly on the table, watching the ice catch the low blue light. "The Dragos. It's the obvious answer. Dante's been making noise for months about expanding west, and you've been the wall in his way since his father died and left him the throne. A pregnant woman with amnesia showing up at your door right when tensions are already at a boil. That's either the world's cruelest coincidence, or somebody's playing a long game, and we haven't seen the board yet." "If it's Dante, why put her in my house? Why not just kill her outright, or use her as leverage from a distance?" "Maybe that's the point," Enzo said. "Maybe somebody wants you distracted, wants you sitting up nights playing protector to a stranger while the real move happens somewhere you're not looking." Alessandro's jaw tightened, because it was a good theory, and he hated it precisely because it was good. He hadn't survived this long by ignoring good theories just because they were inconvenient. "Keep digging," he said, quietly. "I don't want this getting back to the street before we know what we're dealing with." "And the girl? What about her?" "You planning to keep a pregnant stranger in your house indefinitely, boss? Because that's not exactly standard procedure. Word's already moving. People are asking questions." "Let them ask." Enzo studied him for a long moment, the way old friends do when they're deciding whether to say the thing that will make the conversation uncomfortable. "You've got a look on your face I haven't seen before, Sandro. Not since—" He stopped himself. "Don't," Alessandro said, low and flat, a warning wrapped in 2 letters. "I'm not saying anything. I'm just saying I've known you since we were 19 years old, robbing card games in Cicero, and I have never once seen you sit up all night with your hand on somebody's door like you were afraid the house would fall down if you looked away." Alessandro didn't answer, because there was no answer that wouldn't be a lie, and lying to Enzo had never come easily to him. Across the club, near the private elevator that led up to the executive floor, a familiar figure detached herself from a knot of admirers and began making her way toward their booth with the unhurried confidence of a woman who had never once doubted her welcome anywhere. "Vivian," Alessandro said, without looking up, before she'd even arrived. "You always did have a sixth sense for me." Vivian Castellano dropped into the booth beside him, all silk and perfume and old familiarity, her hand landing on his forearm with the ease of long habit. "I heard you've been keeping house with a stray, Sandro. The whole city's talking about it. Alessandro Moretti, playing nursemaid to a pregnant woman he pulled out of the mud. It's very unlike you. I almost don't believe it." "Believe what you want." "Is she pretty, at least? Tell me she's pretty. It would be too tragic if you'd finally found sentiment, and it was for someone plain." Vivian's smile was sharp, amused, the kind of smile that had once, years ago, meant something to him, before ambition and old grudges had worn the feeling down to something more like habit than love. "Vivian, I'm teasing, darling." Her hand tightened briefly on his arm, a claim however old and however faded. "Though I'll admit, I'm curious what kind of woman gets to sleep under your roof when I never did." "That's not what this is." "No?" She tilted her head, studying him with the particular attention of a woman who knew him too well to be easily deceived. "Then what is it?" Alessandro thought of Rain's face in the stormlight, the way her hand had curved instinctively over her stomach, even unconscious. The way she'd cried this morning, not delicately, but with the raw, frightened honesty of someone who had lost everything except the thing growing inside her, and felt something in his chest that he did not have a category for. Something that had nothing to do with strategy or family or the endless calculus of power he'd been running since he was 17 years old and buried his father. "I don't know yet," he said, which was, for a man who always knew everything, its own kind of confession. Vivian's eyes narrowed, some old possessive instinct sparking behind them, and Alessandro understood, distantly, that he had just made an enemy of a woman who had once been something close to an ally. He found, watching her go, that he couldn't bring himself to care. The nightmares started on the 4th night. Rain woke, gasping, the sheets tangled around her legs, her heart slamming against her ribs like something trying to escape, and for a long, disoriented moment, she didn't know where the panic was coming from, only that her hands were shaking and her face was wet, and somewhere in the dark behind her eyes a voice had been screaming her name. Not rain. Something else. Something that slid away the moment she reached for it, like water through fingers. She was still sitting upright, breathing hard, when the door opened without a knock. The particular liberty of a man who had apparently decided, somewhere in the last 4 days, that her door was not a boundary that applied to him. And Alessandro stood silhouetted in the hallway light, a gun in one hand, already scanning the room for a threat, before his eyes landed on her, shaking and alone, and the gun lowered. "What happened?" he said. Not a question, a demand, low and urgent. "Nothing. A nightmare." She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes, embarrassed at being caught like this, unravelled and frightened in the middle of the night. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to wake anyone." "You didn't wake me. I don't sleep much." He crossed the room and set the gun down on the nightstand with the careless ease of a man for whom weapons were simply furniture, and sat on the edge of the bed the way he had that first morning, close, solid, not touching. "Tell me what you saw." "It doesn't make sense. It's just pieces." She closed her eyes, chasing the fragments before they dissolved entirely. "Water. Black water, like a lake. But I was afraid of it, not drowning afraid. Afraid of something else. And there was a voice, a man's voice, saying my name, except I don't know what he said because I woke up before I could hear it." "Anything else?" "A ring." She looked down at her own hand, empty, unadorned, and frowned. "I keep seeing a ring. Not on my hand, in my hand. Like I was holding it or hiding it or, I don't know. It doesn't make sense." Alessandro was quiet for a moment, his expression unreadable in the dim light, though she was learning to read the stillness in him as its own kind of language. The more careful he went, the more he was thinking. "Faro said this might happen," he said finally. "Memory doesn't usually come back all at once. It comes back in pieces, and sometimes the pieces don't make sense until you have enough of them." "What if I don't want them to make sense?" The words came out before she could stop them, raw and unplanned. "What if whatever happened to me is bad enough that some part of me chose to forget it? What if I get my memory back and I find out I'm—" She stopped, throat tight. "You're what?" "I don't know." "A bad person. Someone who deserved whatever put that head wound there. Someone running from something they did instead of something that was done to them." Something shifted in Alessandro's face. Not quite a smile, but close to one, softened at the edges by an emotion she hadn't seen from him before. "I don't think that's who you are. You don't know who I am. Neither do I." "No," he agreed. "But I've spent my whole life reading people, Rain. It's the only skill that's ever kept me alive. And I'm telling you, whatever you were running from, you weren't running because you did something wrong. You were running because someone was trying to take something from you that you weren't willing to give up. The baby. Maybe." His gaze dropped briefly to the curve of her stomach beneath the blankets, and something protective and dark moved across his face, gone almost as quickly as it arrived. Or maybe something else. But whatever it is, you fought for it hard enough to end up half dead in a stranger's yard rather than let it go. That's not the profile of a bad person, Rain. That's the profile of someone worth protecting. She studied him in the low light, the sharp lines of his face, the darkness in his eyes that never seemed to fully lift, even when he was being, in his own careful way, kind, and felt the strange, dangerous pull of him settle deeper into her chest. "Why do you care?" she asked, quiet. "You don't know me. I could be anyone. I could be dangerous to you, to this house, to everyone in it. You said it yourself. Men like you don't invite this kind of attention. So why did you?" He was silent for a long moment, long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer at all. "I don't know," he said finally, and it was the second time in 4 days she'd heard him admit that. A man who clearly built his entire life on certainty, confessing twice now to not knowing something. "I've asked myself the same question every night since I carried you in from that storm. I don't have a good answer for you. I just know that when I saw you lying in the mud, something in me decided you weren't leaving until I understood why you were there. And every day since then, that decision's gotten harder to walk back." "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed, and this time the almost smile made it fully to his mouth, brief and startling and gone. "It's not. I'm not used to not having answers. It's an uncomfortable position for a man in my line of work." "What is your line of work exactly? Sophia mentioned—" She hesitated. "I know what Sophia told you." His voice didn't change, but something in his posture did, a careful bracing, like a man readying himself for a verdict. "It's true. All of it. I run a family that most of this city is afraid of, and the parts of it they're not afraid of, they should be. I've done things you would not want to know about, and I will do more of them before I'm done, because that's the only way men like me stay alive long enough to keep the people around them safe." He held her gaze, steady, unflinching, offering the truth without apology or excuse. "If that changes how you feel about being in this house, I understand. But I won't lie to you about who I am. Not when you have so little else to hold on to." Rain sat with that for a long moment, the truth of him, delivered plainly, without the softening most men would have reached for, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that it didn't frighten her the way it should have. "Thank you," she said finally, "for telling me the truth, even the ugly parts." "Especially the ugly parts," he said. "Pretty lies are how people end up hurt. I'd rather you know exactly what you're dealing with." He rose to leave, gathering the gun from the nightstand with the same casual efficiency, and paused at the door, looking back at her, small and shaken and impossibly, dangerously important to him, this stranger the storm had brought. And Rain thought, watching him, that whoever she had been before, that woman had never met anyone like this. She was sure of it, in the one certain place left in her mind. "Alessandro," she said, before he could leave. "Yes?" "Stay, just until I fall asleep. Please." He looked at her for a long moment, something moving behind his dark eyes that she couldn't name, and then he came back and sat in the chair by the bed, the way he had that first morning, and said nothing at all, and stayed until her breathing evened out into sleep, and stayed a while longer after that, watching over her the way he had not watched over anyone in a very long time. 2 weeks passed, and the house learned to accommodate her the way a body learns to accommodate a healing wound, carefully at first, and then without thinking about it at all. Rain took her meals in the sunroom, or sometimes, when the weather allowed, on the terrace overlooking the lake, and Alessandro found reasons, increasingly transparent reasons, Sophia liked to point out with a raised eyebrow, to be present for most of them. He brought files to review at the breakfast table. He took calls on the terrace instead of in his study. He had, without ever quite announcing it, restructured the geography of his own life around the orbit of a woman with no name and no memory, who had somehow become the fixed point around which everything else moved. "You don't have to keep me company," she told him one afternoon, watching him frown at his phone over a stack of documents he clearly wasn't reading. "I know you're a busy man. I'm not that fragile." "I know you're not." He didn't look up from the phone, though his mouth had curved slightly, the ghost of amusement he allowed himself more and more often around her. "I like the company." "You like watching over things you've decided are yours," she said, echoing Sophia's words without quite meaning to, and watched his eyes come up sharp and quick at that, something unguarded flashing across his face before he mastered it. "Is that what Sophia told you?" "She might have mentioned something along those lines." "Sophia talks too much." But he set the phone down, giving up the pretense of working, and studied her instead with the full weight of his attention, the way he did when he decided a conversation mattered more than whatever else was competing for his focus. "Does it bother you, being watched over?" Rain considered the question honestly, turning it over the way she'd learned to turn over most things in the strange, floating present she now lived in, unmoored from any past to measure it against. "No," she admitted. "It should, probably. I don't know anything about myself, but I have a feeling I wasn't the kind of woman who liked being managed. And yet—" She looked at him, at the careful attention in his dark eyes, at the stillness that somehow always felt more like shelter than threat when it was aimed at her. "It doesn't feel like being managed. It feels like—" "Like what?" "Like being chosen," she said, and watched something flare hot and dangerous behind his eyes at the word, quickly banked, but not quickly enough that she missed it. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Can I ask you something? You've been asking me things for 2 weeks. Something different." He leaned forward slightly, forearms on his knees, his gaze steady on hers in a way that made her pulse pick up before he'd even said the question. "If your memory never comes back, if we never find out who you were, or who did this to you, or what you were running from, what then?" The question landed in her chest like a stone dropped into still water, rings spreading outward into every corner of the fear she'd been carrying since she woke up in this house with nothing but a stranger's borrowed name. "I don't know," she admitted. "I try not to think about it. It's easier to believe the memories will come back eventually than to imagine building a whole life out of nothing." "You wouldn't be building it out of nothing." His voice had dropped, low and rough at the edges, and something in the air between them had gone taut, charged, the particular electricity of two people standing very close to a line neither had yet decided to cross. "You'd be building it here, with me, if you wanted that. I know it's not—" He stopped, jaw working, a man visibly wrestling with words that didn't come naturally to him. "I don't say things like this. I want you to understand that. I don't do sentiment. I don't do promises. I've spent my whole adult life making sure nothing could get close enough to be used against me. But you're already close, Rain. Closer than I know what to do with. And I find that I don't particularly want to do anything about it, except see how much closer you'll let me get." Rain's breath caught, the ache in her chest sharpening into something that felt dangerously close to hope, dangerously close to want. Alessandro. I know. He held up a hand, not quite touching her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off his skin. I know what you're going to say. You don't know who you are. You might have a life somewhere waiting for you, a husband, a family, people who love you and are looking for you right now. I know all the reasons this is reckless. I've run the calculation 100 times since the night I found you, and it never comes out in my favour. His eyes searched hers, dark and unguarded, in a way she hadn't seen from him before, not once, not even in the middle of the night when he'd sat with her through nightmares. But I look at you, and I don't care what the calculation says. That's never happened to me before. Not once. Not in 34 years. You don't know me, she whispered. The same argument she'd made before, though it had less conviction behind it now, worn thin by 2 weeks of his careful, relentless presence. No, he agreed. But I know how you take your coffee. I know you hum when you think no one's listening, some tune you don't even know the name of. I know you flinch every time a car door slams too hard, and I know you cried the first time you saw the ultrasound Pharaoh showed you, not because you were sad, but because some part of you already loves that baby so much it terrifies you. I know you're brave in a way most people who've never lost their memory don't understand, because you're rebuilding yourself one day at a time, and you haven't once asked me to make it easier. He reached up, finally, and brushed a strand of hair back from her face, his fingers lingering at her temple, gentle in a way that seemed to cost him something, like gentleness was a language he'd had to relearn from scratch. I don't need your past to know who you are, Rain. I've been watching you become someone for 2 weeks, and I like every version of her I've seen. Tears rose, unbidden, and she let them, because crying in front of him had stopped, sometime in the last 2 weeks, feeling like weakness. I'm afraid, she admitted, of wanting this, of wanting you. What if I remember, and I'm someone who was never allowed to want this? What if there's a life out there I'm betraying just by sitting here, letting you say these things to me? Then we'll deal with that when it comes. His hand slid down to cup her jaw, thumb brushing gently along her cheekbone, and the space between them had shrunk to almost nothing, his breath warm against her mouth. But I'm not going to pretend I don't want you, just because the timing is complicated. I've never been a patient man, Rain, but for you, I'll wait as long as it takes. I just need you to know that I'm not going anywhere. Not until you tell me to. He didn't kiss her. That was, she would realize later, the most devastating thing about that moment, that a man capable of such violence, such ruthless certainty in every other part of his life, held himself back from the one thing they both wanted, because he'd decided, in some deep and unshakable part of himself, that she deserved to choose it fully, memory or no memory, rather than have it taken in a moment of vulnerability. He rose instead, pressed a kiss to the crown of her head, chaste, controlled, and somehow more intimate than any kiss on the mouth could have been, and left her alone on the terrace, with her heart pounding, and her hand pressed to her stomach, where the baby had chosen that exact moment to kick, hard, as if in agreement with everything that had just been left unsaid. The man arrived on a Tuesday, dressed as a florist delivery driver, and it was only Marco's paranoid habit of checking every vehicle against the estate's approved list that caught the discrepancy. A van, registered to a company that had dissolved 8 months prior, driven by a man whose photo, when Enzo ran it, matched no florist employee record anywhere in the state. They took him quietly in the service entrance before he ever got near the house. "He's not talking," Enzo reported that evening, finding Alessandro in his study, where he'd been staring at the same page of a shipping contract for 20 minutes without absorbing a word of it. "Professional. No wallet, no phone. Prince filed off 2 fingers years ago. But we got a partial hit on facial recognition before he clammed up. He's ex-Drago muscle. Dante cut him loose about a year back. Some kind of falling out. We don't know the details." Alessandro set the contract down. Cut loose or planted? That's the question, isn't it? Enzo dropped into the chair across the desk, weary in the particular way that came from a long day of extracting information from a man who very much did not want to give it. "Here's the part you're going to want to sit with. We showed him a photo of the girl." And he went white as a sheet, Sandro. Recognized her instantly. Didn't say a word, but he didn't have to. Whoever she is, the Dragos know her. And judging by the way our friends' hands were shaking, they're not exactly fond memories. Alessandro was quiet for a long moment, turning that over, feeling the shape of a conspiracy he still couldn't fully see, forming in the dark at the edges of his understanding. "Bring the girl down. I want to try something." They found Rain in the library, curled in a window seat with a book she wasn't really reading, one hand resting, as it almost always did now, over the curve of her stomach. She looked up when they entered, reading something in Alessandro's face that made her sit up straighter, some old instinct for danger sharpening her attention, even without the memories to explain where that instinct came from. "What is it?" "We caught someone on the property today," Alessandro said, choosing his words with the care of a man handling something fragile. "Posing as a delivery driver. Enzo believes he was sent to surveil the house, possibly to confirm you were here." Her hand tightened on the book. "Sent by who?" "A rival family, the Dragos." He watched her face carefully as he said the name, looking for the flicker of recognition he half hoped and half dreaded to find. "Does that name mean anything to you?" Something moved behind her eyes. Not full recognition, but the shadow of it, a door rattling on its hinges without quite opening. "I don't—" She pressed a hand to her temple, wincing. "It feels familiar, like a word I've heard in a dream. Dante." The name came out of her unbidden, and she startled at her own voice saying it. "Why would I know that name?" Alessandro's jaw went tight, a muscle flickering at the hinge of it. "Dante Drago runs the family. He's young, took over 18 months ago when his father died. Ambitious, ruthless, been pushing hard against my territory ever since." He crouched in front of her, taking her free hand in his, without seeming to think about the gesture at all. Some instinct toward comfort that had become second nature between them these past weeks. "Rain, I need you to think very carefully. Is it possible you know him? That you were involved with the Dragos somehow, before?" "I don't know." Her voice had gone thin with fear, the book forgotten in her lap. "I don't know, Alessandro. I don't remember. But every time you say his name, something in my chest goes cold. Like my body remembers, even if I don't." "That's all right." He squeezed her hand, steady, grounding. "That's more than we had an hour ago." "What does it mean?" she asked. "If the Dragos know me, if they sent someone to find me, does that mean I'm one of them? That I've been lying here in your house, in your bed practically, and I'm actually—" "No." The word came out hard, immediate, brooking no argument. Whatever you were to the Dragos, you weren't lying to me. You didn't know any of this an hour ago any more than I did. And the fact that they sent someone to confirm your location instead of simply announcing themselves tells me they're not looking for a lost family member, Rain. They're looking for a target. The word hung in the air between them, ugly and cold, and Rain felt the last of her fragile calm crack under the weight of it.
Why would they want to hurt me?
Her voice had risen, thin with panic. I'm pregnant. Whatever I did, whatever I know, why would that be worth this? Alessandro's eyes dropped, involuntarily, to the curve of her stomach, and something passed across his face, a calculation, quick and unwelcome, that he clearly hated himself for making, even as he made it. Maybe it's not about what you did, he said slowly. Maybe it's about what you're carrying. The room went very still. The baby, Rain whispered. I don't know that for certain, Alessandro said quickly, seeing the terror bloom across her face. It's a theory, but if the Dragos believe that child matters to some conflict I don't yet understand, a claim, an alliance, a piece of leverage, that would explain a great deal. Why they'd risk exposure to confirm you're here. Why someone hurt you badly enough to send you running through a storm rather than simply talking to you. I need to know, Rain said, gripping his hand hard enough that her knuckles went white. I need to know what I am to them, what this baby is to them. I can't keep sitting in this house, not knowing if I'm putting everyone I care about in danger just by existing. Everyone I care about. She heard the words leave her own mouth and understood, distantly, underneath the fear, that she had just told him something true without meaning to. That somewhere in the last 3 weeks, this house, this dangerous man, had stopped being a place she was hiding and started being a place she belonged. You're not putting anyone in danger, Alessandro said, low and fierce, drawing her hand up to press against his chest over the steady, furious drum of his heart. You hear me? Whatever they want, whatever this is, I am not letting anyone touch you or that baby. That's not a promise I'm making lightly, Rain. That's a fact. I've buried better men than Dante Drago for lesser insults than sending someone onto my land. She looked at him, the certainty in his face, the barely leashed violence coiled just beneath the surface of his stillness, all of it aimed entirely at protecting her, and felt something in her chest crack open, wide and frightened and impossibly grateful. They're going to come for me, she said quietly. Aren't they? Alessandro's expression didn't change, but his grip on her hand tightened, and when he spoke, his voice had the flat, absolute certainty of a man who had already decided how the story would end. Let them try. They came 4 nights later, under cover of a fog so thick it swallowed the estate's perimeter lights into soft, useless halos. And they came with the professional efficiency of men who had planned for weeks, not days. Alessandro would learn later that they'd cut the power to the north fence first, a full 90 seconds before the backup generators kicked in, and in that 90-second window, 6 men in dark tactical gear had come over the wall near the boathouse, moving fast and low through the trees toward the house. He was awake when the first alarm sounded. He'd barely slept since the delivery driver's arrest, some old soldier's instinct keeping him alert to a threat he could feel gathering even before it announced itself. And he was in the hallway outside Rain's room, gun already drawn, before Enzo's voice crackled urgently over the radio. Breach at the north wall. Multiple hostiles. Boss, they're moving toward the house. Lock it down, Alessandro said, already moving, already inside Rain's room where she was sitting bolt upright in bed, pale and frightened, roused by the alarm's distant wail. Get dressed, now. We're moving. What's happening? Company, he said grimly, pulling her up out of the bed with one hand, while the other kept his gun trained on the door. Panic room, west wing, behind the library. Move. She moved, some old survival instinct overriding the fear, following him through the dark corridors of the house at a half-run, while gunfire, sharp, close, terrifyingly real, began to crack somewhere below them, his men engaging the intruders on the ground floor. Are they here for me? She gasped, one hand braced against her stomach as they ran. Doesn't matter why they're here, Alessandro said, pulling her around a corner and shoving her behind him as a shape moved in the shadows ahead, one of the intruders having somehow already breached the second floor, gun raised. Alessandro didn't hesitate. 2 shots, fast and precise, and the man crumpled without a sound. Rain made a small, horrified noise behind him, and he turned, grabbing her face in both hands, forcing her eyes up to his. Look at me. Only me. You don't look at anything else, you understand? We are getting you to safety, and nothing is going to happen to you or that baby while I am breathing. Do you trust me? Yes, she said, and meant it with a certainty that startled her even in the chaos, even with a dead man 10 feet away and gunfire echoing up the stairwell. They made it to the library, and Alessandro was reaching for the hidden panel behind the 3rd bookshelf when a voice spoke from the doorway behind them, calm, almost pleasant, entirely wrong for the violence unfolding through the rest of the house. Alessandro Moretti. I have to say, the reputation undersells you. 2 shots, 1 breath, no hesitation. My father always said you were the most dangerous man in Chicago. I'm starting to believe him. Alessandro turned, positioning his body fully between Rain and the man in the doorway. Young, dark-haired, dressed with an elegance that seemed almost obscene, given the circumstances, flanked by 2 more armed men. Dante, Alessandro said, and his voice had gone to something colder than Rain had ever heard from him, a stillness with teeth in it. You have something that belongs to me, Dante Drago said, his gaze sliding past Alessandro to land on Rain, and something in his expression, not quite hunger, not quite hatred, something colder and more calculating than either, made her blood run to ice. Hello, Elena. It's been a long time. You're looking well, considering. Elena. The name hit her like a physical blow, and for one dizzying moment the world tilted, fragments of memory surging up too fast to grab hold of. A church, white flowers, a man's voice saying her name with tenderness that curdled, later, into something else entirely. A ring clutched so hard in her palm, it left marks. That's not her name, Alessandro said, though something in his voice had sharpened, hearing the way she'd gone rigid at the word. Isn't it? Dante's smile was thin, cold, entirely without warmth. Ask her. Ask her if the name feels familiar, Moretti. Ask her whose child she's carrying, and whether you're quite so eager to die for a woman who was promised to someone else long before she ever fell into your yard. Get out of my house, Alessandro said, and the gun in his hand came up, steady and absolute. I'll go. Dante spread his hands, unbothered, a man confident in the value of the information he'd just detonated in the room. But you'll want to hear the rest of it eventually, Moretti. And when you do, I imagine you'll wish you'd let my men finish what they started tonight. That child isn't just a child. It's the last piece of a war that's been building for 30 years, and you've made yourself a target just by giving it a roof. His eyes cut once more to Rain, something almost gentle beneath the menace, disturbingly personal. I'll be seeing you soon, Elena. This isn't over. It was never going to be over. Not until one of us is dead. He was gone before Alessandro could close the distance, melting back into the fog and chaos with his men, and a moment later Enzo's voice crackled over the radio, hostiles retreating. 3 dead, the rest fled over the wall the way they'd come, the whole assault lasting less than 8 minutes from first breach to full withdrawal. Rain was shaking, her hand pressed white-knuckled to her stomach, staring at the space where Dante Drago had stood, as though she could will the fragments of memory to complete themselves through sheer force of will. "Eleanor," she whispered. "He called me Eleanor." Alessandro turned to her, holstering his weapon, and for the first time since the night he'd found her in the storm, she saw real fear in his eyes. Not fear of the Dragos, not fear of violence, but fear of the truth that had just cracked open between them, vast and unknown, and already, somehow, changing everything. "Eleanor," he repeated, testing the name, and something in his expression told her he was already turning it over, already searching some buried corner of his memory for why it mattered, why a name spoken by his enemy had landed in the room like a second gunshot. "That name means something to you?" "I don't know," she said, and it was true. And it was also, for the first time in weeks, a lie, because somewhere behind her eyes a door had finally cracked open, and she could feel, just at the edges of it, something enormous and terrible waiting on the other side. Neither of them slept. They sat together in Alessandro's study long after the house had settled back into its uneasy quiet, the bodies removed, the breach in the north wall already under repair by men who worked without questions at 3 in the morning, because questions were not part of their job description. Rain sat curled on the leather sofa with a blanket around her shoulders, and Alessandro sat across from her, a bottle of scotch between them that neither had touched, both of them too wired on adrenaline and unspoken fear to want the dulling comfort of alcohol. "Eleanor," she said again, testing it, the way she'd been testing it for hours. "It doesn't feel like nothing. It doesn't feel like Rain felt when you gave it to me. It feels heavier, like putting on a coat that used to fit and doesn't anymore." "You don't have to force it," Alessandro said. "The memory will come when it comes." "I don't want to wait for it to come." Her voice cracked, frustration and fear tangled together. "Dante knew things about me, about the baby. He said I was promised to someone. He said this baby is the last piece of some war that's been building for 30 years. That's not nothing, Alessandro. That's my whole life, sitting on the other side of a door I can't open, and everyone around me knows more about it than I do." "I know." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and reached across the space between them to take her hand, the gesture as natural now as breathing. "I hate it too. I hate not knowing what I'm protecting you from. I hate that a man who tried to kill you tonight knows your real name, and I don't." "Tell me about you instead," she said suddenly. "Please. I've been living in your house for 3 weeks, and I know almost nothing about who you are underneath all this." She gestured vaguely at the study, the estate, the whole dangerous architecture of his world. How does a person become you? What happened to make you into someone who carries guns like other men carry car keys? He was quiet for a long moment, and she thought he might deflect, the way he usually did when conversations veered too close to anything soft in him. Instead, he set his glass down and began, slowly, to speak. My father built this family out of nothing. Came over from Sicily with $200 and a willingness to do things other men wouldn't. By the time I was born, we had money, power, respect, all the things he'd bled for. He wanted me soft, wanted me to go to good schools, marry well, stay out of the business entirely. He used to say the whole point of everything he'd built was so his son wouldn't have to build it the same way. What happened? And he was murdered when I was 17. Alessandro's voice stayed level, but something moved behind his eyes, old grief worn smooth by 2 decades of handling. A rival family, not the Dragos, this was before Dante's time, his father ran things back then, decided my father's territory was worth more than his life. They shot him outside a restaurant on Taylor Street, in front of me. I watched him die on the sidewalk, and none of the men who were supposed to protect him did a single thing to stop it, because they were too busy running. Alessandro. Her hand tightened on his, and he let her hold it, let her see the rawness of the memory without flinching away from it. I buried him 3 days later, and then I spent the next 2 years teaching myself everything he tried to keep me from learning. How to run the business, how to hold territory, how to make sure that when men came for what was mine, they understood exactly what it would cost them. He looked up, and his eyes were dark and steady, absolutely without apology. I became this because the alternative was watching everyone I loved die the way my father did. I decided at 17, standing over his body, that I would rather be feared than be weak. I've never regretted that decision, not once in 17 years. Until now? She asked quietly, reading something new in his face, something that hadn't been there when the story started. Until now, he admitted, because for 17 years, being feared kept me untouchable. Nothing could get close enough to be used against me, because I never let anything get close. And then you fell out of a storm and into my life, and every calculation I've built my whole world around stopped mattering the second I saw your face. That terrifies you, she said, understanding it as she said it. More than anything the Dragos could throw at me. His thumb traced slow circles over the back of her hand, an absent, tender gesture that seemed to surprise even him. I know what it costs to love something in this life, Rain. I watched it cost my father everything. And I still can't make myself walk away from you, even knowing what it might cost me too. The word love hung in the air between them, spoken so quietly and so unguarded that for a moment neither of them seemed to know what to do with it. I don't remember my life before you, Rain said finally, her voice thick. I don't know what I lost, or who I was, or what promises might already exist somewhere in my past that I'm breaking just by sitting here. But I know that when Dante stood in that doorway tonight, the only thing I felt was terror that he might take me away from you. Not away from my old life, away from you. She reached up, cupping his jaw the way he'd cupped hers weeks before, feeling the tension in him ease fractionally at her touch. Whatever Elena's life was, Alessandro, I think some part of me already chose this one instead. He turned his face into her palm, closing his eyes for one unguarded moment. A man who had spent 17 years building walls, allowing them finally to come down, for someone who had no memory of anything except the certainty that she wanted to stay. "I'm not going to lose you," he said, low and fierce, opening his eyes to hold hers. "Not to the Dragos, not to whatever war they think that baby's tangled up in, not to your own past if it comes back and tries to claim you. I have buried men for less than what they did tonight, and I will burn this city to the ground before I let anyone take you out of it." "That's not a very romantic thing to say," she said, half a laugh escaping, despite everything, despite the fear still humming under her skin. "I told you," Alessandro said, and the ghost of a real smile finally broke through, warm and startling, on a face built for cold calculation. "I don't do sentiment. This is the best I've got." "It's enough," she whispered, and when he leaned in this time, slow and deliberate, giving her every chance to pull away, she didn't. She closed the last of the distance herself, and the kiss that followed was nothing like the chaste press of lips to her forehead weeks before. It was slow and searching, and full of everything neither of them had let themselves say out loud until tonight. And when they finally broke apart, breathless, foreheads resting together, Rain understood that whatever storm was still coming, she would face it exactly where she was. Enzo found the record 3 days later, buried in a chain of shell companies and sealed adoption paperwork so deliberately obscured that it took a forensic accountant, 2 hacked databases, and a very expensive favour called in from a judge in Cook County to finally surface it. He brought it to Alessandro's study himself, closing the door behind him with a care that told Alessandro before a word was spoken that whatever was in the folder was going to be complicated. "Elena Rossi," Enzo said, setting the folder down on the desk. 28 years old. Only child of Marco Rossi, who ran a family out of the North Shore back in the 80s and 90s. Smaller than us, smaller than the Dragos, but old, respected, connected to half the families on the East Coast through marriages going back 3 generations. He died 6 years ago. Natural causes, or so the record says. And Elena? Inherited nothing on paper. The family's legitimate assets went into a trust, and by all accounts, she walked away from the life entirely. Went to college under a different surname, built a career as an architect in Boston, kept her head down. Nobody in this business has heard her name mentioned in years. Enzo paused, choosing his next words with visible care. Except for one thing. Buried in Marco Rossi's private papers, the ones the trust lawyers never made public, there's a contract, a betrothal agreement, drawn up almost 30 years ago between Marco Rossi and your father. Alessandro went very still. Say that again? Your father and Marco Rossi were friends, Sandro. Real friends, from before either of them ran their families. They grew up 2 streets apart in the old neighbourhood. When Eleanor was born and you were 3 years old, they signed an agreement. A union between the families, sealed by marriage once the children came of age. It was old world, even by the standards of the time, the kind of thing families used to do to guarantee peace between territories. Your father never told you because he died before it ever came due, and Rossi let it lapse quietly, rather than force the issue on a widow's son who didn't know the arrangement existed. Alessandro sat with that for a long moment, the study silent except for the low hum of the lake wind against the windows, feeling the ground shift under a life he'd thought he understood completely. "She was promised to me," he said slowly. "My whole life. And neither of us ever knew." "That's not the part that matters most," Enzo said grimly. "Keep reading." Alessandro opened the folder and found 3 pages in a photocopy of a second document, newer, the ink still legible, dated less than a year ago. A merger agreement, this one, between Marco Rossi's dormant territory, inherited on paper by Elena, whether she wanted it or not, and the Drago family. Not a business merger, a marriage contract, drawn up by Dante Drago's father in his final months, promising his son to Elena Rossi as a way of absorbing the last of the Rossi territory and legitimacy into Drago hands. "She said no," Enzo said. "According to the lawyer who drew up the paperwork, Elena refused the arrangement outright the moment she learned of it. Said she wanted nothing to do with the life, wanted the territory dissolved, wanted to disappear back into her architecture firm and never hear the Drago name again. Dante's father died a month later, and Dante inherited both the family and the unfinished contract. And he didn't take no for an answer. Worse, Enzo's jaw tightened. There's a note here from a private investigator Elena hired, dated 7 months ago, right around the time she'd have gotten pregnant. She'd started a relationship with someone, a man she met in Boston. No mafia connection at all, someone completely outside this world. And according to the investigator's notes, Dante found out and made it very clear that if Elena wouldn't marry him willingly, he intended to claim the child instead, legally, financially, through whatever version of ugly leverage the old betrothal contracts still allowed him. The baby she's carrying isn't Dante's, Sandro. But because of that contract, if the Rossi territory and legitimacy pass through her bloodline, Dante believes he can force a claim on the child regardless of who the father is. As far as he's concerned, that baby is the last piece of Rossi legitimacy left in the world, and he intends to have it, one way or another. Alessandro closed his eyes briefly, absorbing the full, ugly shape of it. A woman running not from a monster in the shadows, but from a legal, generational trap laid decades before she was born. A contract written in the language of old-world peace that had curdled, in the hands of a man like Dante Drago, into something closer to a hunting license. "Where's the child's father?" he asked. "The man from Boston." Enzo's silence answered before his words did. "Dead. 3 months ago. Car accident, according to the official report." "I don't believe in accidents that convenient, and neither should you." Alessandro's hands curled into fists on the desk, a cold fury moving through him that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with the woman upstairs who had lost the man she loved and half her memory in the same brutal span of months, running alone and pregnant through a storm because there had been no one left to run to. "She doesn't remember any of this," he said quietly. "No. And I'd think carefully about how you tell her, Sandro. This isn't just her past. It's a dead man she loved, a betrothal contract that ties her to your family whether either of you wanted it or not, and a monster who's already proven he'll come through your walls to get what that contract promises him." Enzo's expression softened, some of the old friendship breaking through the professional delivery. "You care about her. I can see that plainly enough, but you're about to hand her a truth that's going to break her heart in about 6 different directions at once, And there's no version of this where it doesn't. Alessandro looked at the folder, at the photograph clipped to the front of it, an old society page photo of a much younger Elena Rossi at some charity gala, laughing at something out of frame, radiant and untouched by any of what was coming for her, and felt the full weight of what he was about to do settle onto his shoulders like a stone. "Bring her down," he said. "She deserves to know the truth, all of it, tonight." She sat very still as he told her, the folder open on the low table between them, and Alessandro watched something break and rebuild itself behind her eyes with every sentence, watched 28 years of stolen life pour back into a mind that had spent a month floating free of all of it. "Elena Rossi," she said when he finished, testing the full name, the way she'd tested the fragments of it before. "That's—" Her hand pressed to her mouth, and for a moment Alessandro thought she might be sick, or might simply shatter, the weight of it all arriving at once after weeks of careful, fragmentary return. "I remember my father's study, dark wood, cigar smoke. I remember hating it, hating everything it meant, and running as far from it as I could the second I turned 18. You don't have to force any more of it tonight." "No." She shook her head, tears already tracking down her face, but her voice had taken on a fierce, urgent clarity, a woman reaching for a life she'd been robbed of and refusing to let it slip away again, now that she'd finally found the edge of it. "It's coming, Alessandro. All of it. Please, let me remember." He said nothing, only took her hand and watched her close her eyes and go somewhere he couldn't follow. "His name was David," she said finally, her voice breaking on it. "David Chen. An architect, like me. We met on a project in Boston, a mixed-use development downtown. He didn't know anything about my family, didn't care when I finally told him, terrified he'd run the second he understood what I came from. He held my face and told me none of that mattered, that I wasn't my father's daughter to him. I was just Elena." A sob broke loose, raw and unguarded. "We were going to get married in the spring. I found out I was pregnant 2 weeks after Dante's father died, and everything after that." She stopped, shaking, and Alessandro pulled her against his chest, holding her while the memory tore through her in ragged pieces. "Dante came to see me himself," she continued, muffled against his shirt. "Told me about the contract, about his father's dying wish. Told me I was going to marry him whether I wanted to or not, that the Rossi name and everything attached to it belonged to the Dragos now by right. I told him to go to hell. I told him I was already engaged, already pregnant, already building a life that had nothing to do with any of it." Her hands fisted in his shirt. 3 days later, David was dead. They called it an accident. I knew the second I heard it. I knew what it really was. But I couldn't prove anything. And Dante made sure I understood, very clearly, that the same thing would happen to me and to this baby if I kept refusing him. "So you ran," Alessandro said quietly. "I ran. I didn't know where. I didn't have a plan. I got in my car in the middle of that storm because I'd gotten a message from someone, a warning that Dante's men were coming for me that night, and I just drove, as far and as fast as I could, until I ran out of road and gas and everything else. And I don't remember the last part. I don't remember getting out of the car or falling. I just remember being so afraid and so alone, and thinking that if I died in that storm, At least they couldn't take the baby from me while I was breathing. Alessandro held her through the worst of it, through the grief that had been waiting a full month to finally arrive, through the fresh horror of remembering not just David's death, but the terror of the flight that had nearly killed her too. And when she finally quieted, exhausted and hollowed out, he pressed his lips to her hair and spoke, low and certain, into the dark. "I am so sorry," he said, "for David, for everything Dante took from you before I ever had the chance to stand between you and him. It's not your fault." "No," he agreed, "but it's my fight now, all of it." He pulled back enough to look at her, cupping her face in both hands, thumbs brushing away the last of the tears. "Elena." He tested the name carefully, watching her reaction to it. "Is that what you want me to call you? Or is Rain still—" "Elena," she said, with a certainty that surprised them both. "I want my name back, all of it, even the parts that hurt." She held his gaze, something steadying in her even through the wreckage of grief. "But I'm not the same person who ran from that contract 8 months ago, Alessandro. I remember her. I remember hating everything my father's world represented, wanting nothing to do with any of it. But I'm not her anymore. I've spent a month in your house watching what a family like this can be when it's led by someone who actually protects the people in it instead of using them. I don't hate this world the way I used to. I just hate what Dante's made of it." "There's something else," Alessandro said carefully. "Something I need you to know, and I need you to hear it from me before you hear it any other way." "What?" "The contract wasn't just between your father and the Dragos." He took a breath, watching her face for the moment of understanding. "There was an earlier one, between your father and mine. A betrothal, drawn up before either of us was old enough to walk. You were promised to me first, Eleanor, long before Dante's father ever tried to claim you." The silence that followed stretched long and taut, and Alessandro watched a dozen emotions move across her face. Shock, and something that might have been dark humour at the absurdity of it. And underneath all of it, something quieter and more searching, as if she were testing the idea against the weeks they'd already spent together, and finding, to her own visible surprise, that it didn't feel like an invasion at all. "So this whole time," she said slowly, "some part of the universe already had us written down together before either of us ever chose it." "It seems that way." "Does that bother you?" she asked, finding out that what's happened between us was, in some old and complicated way, already decided for us before we were born. Alessandro considered the question with the same weight he gave to every decision that mattered, and when he answered, his voice had gone soft in a way she'd only heard a handful of times since the storm. "No," he said, "because I didn't fall for a contract, Eleanor. I fell for a woman with no name, sitting in my sunroom, hand pressed protectively over a baby she didn't even remember choosing to love. Whatever our fathers wrote down 30 years ago doesn't matter to me. What matters is that I would choose you again, today, with a full memory of every complicated thing standing between us, because none of it changes how I feel when you're in the room." She kissed him then, fierce and grateful and grieving all at once, a woman rebuilding herself in real time out of grief and truth and the fragile, stubborn hope of something new. And outside the windows, the lake wind picked up, carrying the first cold breath of a war neither of them could avoid much longer. Dante Drago sent his answer 3 nights later, and he sent it the way he did everything, with theatre. A single white orchid arrived at the Moretti estate's front gate, delivered by a courier who claimed no knowledge of the sender, tucked into an envelope that contained nothing but a photograph. Elena, at the estate's window, taken from somewhere beyond the property line, despite the reinforced perimeter, along with a single line of type. You can't keep her from what's hers forever, Moretti. I'll see you both at the Onyx. Come alone, or don't come at all. She'll still be mine to claim, eventually. He's telling us he can get eyes on the house whenever he wants, Enzo said grimly, turning the photograph over in his hands. This isn't a threat, it's a demonstration. He's also telling us he wants to negotiate, Alessandro said, jaw tight. Men like Dante don't send party invitations to people they're planning to simply kill. He wants something from me directly, something he thinks he can only get face to face. You're not going alone. I know that. Alessandro folded the photograph and slid it into his jacket, already calculating security, already running the dozen variables of an encounter that could easily become an ambush. But I am going, tonight. If Dante wants to talk, I want to hear exactly what he thinks he's owed, and I want him to understand, in a room full of my own men on my own turf, exactly how badly he miscalculated coming after Elena in my house. Elena, when he told her, went pale but did not argue, which told him more about how much she'd grown in the last month than any words could have. "Let me come," she said instead. "No. Alessandro, no." His voice brooked no argument, hard and absolute. "He wants to see you. That's exactly why you're staying here, behind every gun I own. I'm not walking you into a room with the man who had David killed." Something in her face softened at that, at the fierce protectiveness in his voice, even as frustration warred with gratitude. "Just come back to me. Whatever he says, whatever he offers, come back." "Always," he said, and kissed her hard enough to leave no doubt of it before he left. The Onyx at midnight was a different animal than the club Elena had heard described in passing, thrumming with bass and colour on the surface, but underneath, cleared of civilians on Alessandro's order, the dance floor emptied, except for a scattering of his own men, positioned with the loose, deceptive casualness of soldiers who could be lethal in under 2 seconds. Dante was already waiting in the private booth on the 2nd floor, alone except for a single bodyguard, a glass of wine untouched in front of him, dressed with the same obscene elegance he'd worn the night he'd broken into Alessandro's house. "You came," Dante said, gesturing to the seat across from him. "I confess, I wasn't entirely certain you would. Men in love do unpredictable things." "Say what you came to say, Dante." "Straight to business. I respect that." Dante swirled his wine, considering his words with theatrical care. "You have something I have a legal, generational claim to. I understand the sentiment involved. Truly, I do. Elena's a remarkable woman. I don't blame you for falling under her spell. But sentiment doesn't override 30 years of contracts, Moretti. And it certainly doesn't override the fact that the child she's carrying represents the last uncontested claim to Rossi territory left in this city." "There is no claim," Alessandro said flatly. Elena refused your father's contract while he was still alive. She refused you directly. The child isn't yours, isn't your family's, and isn't a piece of property to be inherited like a warehouse deed. It's a person, and it's under my protection now, along with its mother. Under your protection? Dante's smile turned thin, dangerous. How romantic. Tell me, Moretti, did you know that your own father signed a contract for her hand before you'd learned to walk? Did the great Alessandro Moretti fall in love? Or did he simply fulfill a destiny that was written for him before he had any say in the matter? I don't care what was written 30 years ago, Alessandro said, his voice dropping into the register that made grown men in this city go quiet in rooms far larger than this one. I care about what's true now. And what's true is that you had an innocent man killed to clear a path to a woman who never wanted you. And now you're trying to dress up a kidnapping plot in the language of old-world honor because you know, underneath all of it, that you have no real claim at all. Something flickered behind Dante's eyes, the first crack in the composed theatre of the evening, a flash of the ugly, entitled fury that had, Alessandro suspected, been the real engine behind every move Dante had made since his father's death. You think this ends because you love her, Dante said, low and venomous. It doesn't. My father spent the last months of his life building alliances specifically around that child's future value, Moretti. Half the East Coast families are watching to see how this resolves. If I walk away from this empty-handed, I don't just lose a contract. I lose the confidence of every ally my father spent his life cultivating. That's not a price I'm willing to pay for your romance. Then you're going to lose a great deal more than confidence, Alessandro said, rising from the booth, his voice gone quiet and absolutely final. Because I am telling you, in this room, in front of your own man, exactly once. If you come near Eleanor or that child again, I will not be sending men to your doorstep with warnings and orchids. I will end you, Dante, and I will do it in a way that makes every ally your father cultivated understand precisely why they should have stayed out of this. That's not a threat. That's the last mercy I intend to offer you. Dante's composure cracked fully then, something young and furious surfacing beneath the polish. You'll regret this, Moretti. I doubt it, Alessandro said, and walked out of the onyx without looking back, already dialing Enzo before he'd reached the stairs, already setting in motion the machinery of a war he'd been trying for weeks to avoid. Because some conversations, he understood now, could only end one way, and he would rather meet that ending head-on than let it come for Elena while his back was turned. Vivian Castellano did not take rejection quietly, and she took it least quietly of all when the rejection came wrapped in obvious, undeniable devotion to another woman. She arrived at the estate 2 days after the confrontation at the Onyx, unannounced, using an old relationship with the household staff to talk her way past the front gate before Enzo could intervene, and found Elena alone on the terrace, hand resting on the curve of her stomach, watching the lake. You must be the famous Rain, Vivian said, settling into the chair across from her without invitation, her tone dripping with a pleasantness so brittle it could have cracked glass. Or is it Elena now? I've heard so many versions of your story I've lost track. Elena studied the other woman carefully, beautiful in a sharp, deliberate way, dressed for a war she'd clearly come intending to fight. I'm sorry, I don't think we've met. No, we haven't. Vivian Castellano. She extended a manicured hand, and Elena shook it, wary. Old friend of Alessandro's. Very old. Very close once, before you fell out of a storm and rewrote every rule he's ever lived by. I'm not sure what you want me to say to that. I don't want you to say anything, darling. I want you to understand what you've walked into. Vivian's smile sharpened. Alessandro Moretti does not fall in love. I have known that man for 12 years, since before he was running the whole operation, and in all that time, I have never once seen him choose sentiment over strategy. Do you know why that is?
I imagine you're going to tell me.
Because sentiment gets people killed in this world. His father died because he let his guard down for the people he loved. Alessandro built his entire life avoiding that exact mistake. Vivian leaned forward, and beneath the venom, Elena caught something that looked almost like genuine warning. And now, here you are, a walking liability with a rival family's claim attached to your unborn child, and he's turned his entire house upside down for you. I've watched men make exceptions like this before, Elena. It never ends well. Either the exception gets them killed, or it gets the people around them killed instead. Is that concern for me, Elena asked evenly, or jealousy dressed up as concern? Something flashed hot behind Vivian's composed exterior, the mask slipping for just a moment. Both, if I'm honest. I spent years positioning myself to be exactly what a man like Alessandro would eventually need. Someone who understood this world, who could be an asset instead of a liability, who wouldn't require an entire security detail rearranged just to keep her safe from a war she brought to his doorstep. And then you fell out of the sky, memoryless and pregnant with another man's child, and somehow you're the one he's rearranged his whole life around. I didn't ask him to. No, Vivian agreed, something almost like respect flickering through the resentment. I don't imagine you did. That's almost the worst part. If you were scheming for this, I could understand it. I could fight it on terms I know. But you're just... She gestured, frustrated, at Elena's whole presence, the quiet dignity of a woman who had lost everything and was rebuilding herself out of grief and gratitude in equal measure. You're just genuinely what he needed, and I never was, no matter how hard I tried to be. Elena felt something unexpected move through her. Not triumph, but a strange, sad kind of sympathy for the woman across from her, who had clearly spent years building herself into a shape she thought a dangerous man would love, only to watch him fall for someone who hadn't tried at all. I'm not trying to take anything from you, she said gently. I didn't even know this world existed a month ago. I'm not fighting you for him, Vivian. I love him. However complicated and reckless and fast that is, given everything.
I'm not going to apologize for that, but I'm also not trying to win some war you've been fighting for years before I ever arrived.
Vivian studied her for a long moment, something in her face shifting, the sharp edges softening fractionally into something more tired, more honest. Do you know the worst thing about all this? I actually believe you, which makes it so much harder to hate you than I'd planned to. She rose, smoothing her skirt, composure reassembling itself piece by piece. A word of advice, since I clearly won't be getting what I came here for. Dante Drago does not lose gracefully. Whatever Alessandro said to him at the club, it will have made things worse, not better. Men like Dante don't back down from public humiliation. They escalate. If you love Alessandro half as much as you're claiming, you'll make sure he understands that his pride at the Onyx just made this war a great deal more dangerous. Why are you telling me this? Elena asked, genuinely surprised. You have every reason to want this to go badly for me. Vivian paused at the edge of the terrace, looking back with an expression that was, for the first time since she'd arrived, entirely unguarded. Because whatever I feel about you, Elena, I still care what happens to Alessandro. I've known him too long not to. And I'd rather see him happy with you than dead because he underestimated how far Dante's willing to go to save face. She turned to leave, then paused once more. For what it's worth, take care of that baby. Whatever else is true, it deserves better than to be a casualty in somebody else's war. She left, and Elena sat alone on the terrace for a long time afterward, one hand pressed to her stomach, feeling the baby shift and settle, and thought, with a clarity that frightened her, that Vivian's warning had the unmistakable ring of truth. Dante would not let the humiliation at the Onyx stand, and whatever came next, she understood now, would come fast, and it would come for blood. That night, Alessandro found her still awake, sitting up in the dark of her room with the lamp off and the curtains open, watching the storm clouds building again over the lake, the same kind of storm that had brought her to him, gathering now like the universe was rhyming with itself. "You should be asleep," he said quietly from the doorway. "I can't." She turned to look at him, and something in her face made him cross the room immediately, sitting beside her on the bed without needing to be asked. Vivian came by today. His jaw tightened. She had no business. "It's fine. We talked. It wasn't as ugly as I expected, honestly." Elena reached for his hand, needing the contact, needing the solid warmth of him to ground the fear still humming under her skin. "She warned me about Dante. Said humiliating him at the club would make him escalate, not retreat. She's not wrong." Alessandro's thumb traced slow circles over her knuckles, an old habit now, worn smooth by weeks of repetition. "I knew that when I said it. I said it anyway, because I needed him to understand exactly what he was dealing with if he came near you again. Sometimes the only way through a man like Dante is to make the cost of continuing higher than the cost of stopping. And if it doesn't stop him, then we'll be ready." He turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "Elena, I need you to understand something, and I need you to hear it without the fear getting in the way. I am not going to let anything happen to you. Not to you, not to the baby. I have spent 17 years building an organization specifically capable of handling threats like Dante Drago, and every resource I have is already moving to make sure this ends the right way." "I'm scared," she admitted, voice small, in a way it rarely was anymore, the fear of the past weeks catching up with her all at once. Not just of Dante, of all of it, of how fast this happened between us, of how much I've come to need you in a month I don't even fully remember. What if this is just trauma or fear or gratitude dressed up as love? What if, once the danger's gone, I look at you and realize I don't actually know what's real? It was the first time she'd voiced the doubt out loud, and she watched it land on him, watched him take the question seriously instead of brushing it aside the way a lesser man might have, eager to protect his own feelings rather than examine hers. "I've thought about that too," he admitted, "more than I'd like to. I know what this looks like from the outside. Dangerous man, wounded woman, adrenaline and proximity doing the work that real feelings should be doing instead. I've turned it over more nights than I can count, lying awake wondering if what I feel for you is real, or if I've simply mistaken protectiveness for something deeper, because you needed me in a way no one has needed me in a very long time. And what did you decide? That it doesn't matter how it started. His eyes held hers, steady and certain in the dark. Elena, I have loved exactly one other thing in my life the way I could tell within days that I loved you. And that thing was my father. And even that love came wrapped in duty and fear and complicated history. What I feel for you isn't complicated at all, underneath everything else going on around us. When you laugh at something Sophia says at dinner, when you hum without realizing it, when you put your hand on your stomach like you're already having a conversation with a person you haven't met yet. Those aren't things I feel because you're in danger or because I'm protecting you. Those are just you. And I choose you every single day, regardless of what started it. Tears rose, and this time she didn't fight them. I love you too, she said, the words coming easier now than they ever had, worn smooth by weeks of building toward this exact moment. I don't know if that's reckless, given everything. I don't know if Elena Rossi, before the storm, would have ever let herself fall this fast for a man like you. But I'm not just her anymore. I'm someone new, built out of everything that's happened since I woke up in your house, and that person loves you completely. He kissed her then, slow and thorough, months of careful restraint finally giving way to something neither of them was interested in holding back any longer. And when he pulled back to search her face for permission, she answered by pulling him closer, and the storm outside broke at last, rain lashing the windows in great sheets, while inside, in the dark, two people who had spent their whole lives building walls finally let them fall completely. Later, tangled together in the aftermath, her head resting on his chest and his hand tracing idle patterns along her spine, Elena felt the baby kick, hard and insistent, and laughed softly into the quiet. I think someone's jealous of the attention, she murmured. Alessandro's hand moved instinctively to cover the spot where the small foot had pressed against her skin, and something in his face, awe and fierce tenderness, and a possessiveness that had nothing to do with contracts or territory, and everything to do with love, settled there, unguarded, for her to see. I'll love this baby like it's my own, he said quietly. I want you to know that. Whatever David would have been to this child, I intend to be that and more. I'm not interested in half measures, Elena. Not with you, and not with this baby. I know, she whispered, and believed it completely. And outside the windows the storm raged on, indifferent to the fragile, hard-won peace they'd built inside it. The attack, when it finally came, did not come from outside the walls. It came from Marco, the same guard who had first caught the delivery driver's discrepancy, the same man Sophia had teased Rain about weeks before, a fixture of the household for 6 years, trusted enough to walk the perimeter alone at night without a second thought from anyone in the organization. Enzo discovered the betrayal by accident, running a routine audit of the estate's security logs after the Onyx confrontation, looking for any sign that Dante's earlier breach had left something behind. What he found instead was a pattern of outgoing calls from Marco's personal phone to a number that traced, after considerable digging, back to a Drago-owned shell account, calls that had started, according to the timestamps, 3 days before Elena had ever collapsed on the estate's lawn.
He's been feeding them information since before she got here, Enzo said, laying the phone records across Alessandro's desk with a grim, controlled fury that mirrored the storm building behind his own eyes. Security rotations, camera blind spots, probably the exact schedule that let their delivery driver get as close as he did before we caught him. Since before she got here, Alessandro repeated slowly, a cold, dawning horror moving through him. Enzo, that means... That means Marco likely knew she was coming, Enzo finished, that the storm, the collapse on our lawn, none of it was an accident, Sandro. I think Dante steered her here on purpose. Alessandro's mind raced backward, reassembling the pieces of the last 2 months with new, terrible clarity. Elena's escape from the Drago threat, her collapse, specifically, at the edge of his property, in a storm severe enough to explain a car running out of road, but convenient enough that a man with Dante's resources could have easily arranged it. Marco's calls, starting before any of it happened. He wanted her to run here, Alessandro said slowly. He wanted her under my protection. Why would he want that? Enzo asked, baffled. He spent the whole time since trying to get her back. Because it isn't about getting her back, Alessandro said, the full shape of the trap finally clicking into terrible focus. It's about legitimacy. Think about it, Enzo. If Elena marries me, willingly, with the full weight of the old betrothal contract behind it, the Rossi territory folds into the Moretti family, not the Dragos. That's a threat to Dante's claim, not an asset to it. Unless... He stopped, jaw tightening. Unless his real goal was never the marriage at all. Unless he wanted a war. Explain. If I marry Elena and the Rossi legitimacy passes to our family, the East Coast alliances Dante's father spent his life building will see it as exactly the kind of encroachment they were trying to prevent by attaching Elena to the Drago name in the first place. Dante doesn't need to win Elena back, Enzo. He needs a justification to move against me openly, with the backing of every ally his father cultivated, without looking like the aggressor who started it. He wanted her here. He wanted me to fall for her. He wanted this exact moment. Because now, when he moves against me, he can tell every family watching that I stole what was rightfully his, instead of admitting he engineered the entire situation from the start. The horror of it settled over the room like a physical weight. Weeks of careful, hard-won love, of grief and healing and slow burning trust, revealed as the opening move in a strategy so cold and so patient that even Alessandro, who had built his life on exactly this kind of calculation, felt something close to awe at the audacity of it. "Bring Marco in," he said, voice gone flat and lethal. Quietly. I want to know exactly how much he's told them. And I want to know it before Dante makes his next move. They found Marco an hour later in the garage, attempting, badly and too late, to disable the tracker Enzo had discreetly attached to his car the moment the phone records surfaced. He didn't resist when they took him, didn't bother denying it once the evidence was laid out in front of him, and Alessandro, standing over the man who had spent 6 years walking the halls of his home while quietly selling every secret in it, felt a fury so absolute it went almost calm. "Why?" Alessandro asked, and it was the only question that mattered. "Money," Marco said, not bothering to dress it up as anything nobler. "Dante paid better than you did, and he paid faster. I didn't think it would go this far, boss." "I swear to God, I didn't know about the girl. Not really. Not until she was already here, and it was too late to say anything without you gutting me for the 6 months before it." "You're going to tell me everything," Alessandro said. "Every call, every detail, every plan Dante's ever mentioned to you, no matter how small it seemed at the time. And then you're going to understand very clearly exactly what it costs a man to betray this family." He left the room before his own fury could tip into something he'd regret in front of Elena, and found her waiting in the hallway outside, pale, having heard enough through the walls to understand the shape of what had happened. "He steered me here," she said quietly, wrapping her arms around herself. "This whole time. I thought I escaped him. I thought falling in that storm was the one accident in this whole nightmare that wasn't his design. And instead, I ran exactly where he wanted me to." "It doesn't matter how you got here," Alessandro said, pulling her against him, feeling her shake against his chest. "It matters that you're here now, and that everything that's happened between us since, every real thing, every true thing, none of that was his design. He may have engineered the beginning. He doesn't get to touch what we've built since." "He's going to come for us," Eleanor whispered. "Isn't he? Now that he knows I know." Alessandro's arms tightened around her, and when he answered, his voice held the flat, absolute certainty of a man who had already begun, in his mind, preparing for war. "Let him come," he said. "Everything he's built has been leading to this moment for months. I intend to end it here, once and for all, on ground I control, on terms I choose." He wanted a wall to justify himself to his allies. Fine, I'll give him one. But he's going to lose it. Labour started 3 weeks early, in the middle of the emergency council Alessandro had called to prepare his organisation for the war he now understood was coming. Elena had been sitting quietly in the corner of the room, listening to Enzo lay out defensive positions and Sophia coordinate with allied families for support, when the first sharp cramp took her breath away, and the second, 10 minutes later, made her gasp loud enough that the entire room went silent. "Elena?" Alessandro was at her side instantly, all strategy forgotten, his hand finding hers. "I think—" Another contraction hit, and she gripped his hand hard enough to leave marks. "I think the baby's coming. It's too early, Alessandro. It's 3 weeks too early." "Faro!" Alessandro barked, already lifting her, and the room dissolved into controlled motion, Sophia already on the phone summoning the doctor, Enzo already reorganizing security around the sudden, urgent shift in priority. "The stress," Elena gasped through gritted teeth, as Alessandro carried her toward the medical suite that had been prepared, with characteristic thoroughness, weeks ago against exactly this possibility. "Faro said stress could bring it early." "Don't talk. Breathe. I've got you." His voice had gone to something she'd never heard from him before. Not the cold command of the boardroom, not the fierce tenderness of their private hours, but something raw and frightened underneath the control. A man facing a danger he could not simply shoot his way through. Faro arrived within 20 minutes, and what followed was hours of the particular, terrifying labour that came with early delivery. Elena's contractions increasing in intensity and frequency, while Faro monitored the baby's vitals with attention that told Alessandro, without needing to be told outright, that this was more dangerous than either of them had let on. The baby's in some distress, Faro admitted quietly, pulling Alessandro aside during a brief lull. Heart rates dropping during contractions. If it doesn't stabilize soon, we may need to consider an emergency cesarean. I don't have full surgical capability here, Alessandro. If it comes to that, we need to move her to the hospital. And I won't pretend that's not a risk, given everything happening with the Dragos. Do whatever keeps them both alive, Alessandro said, voice flat with a fear he was working very hard not to let Elena see. I don't care what it costs or what risks we have to take, both of them. Do you understand me? I understand. Faro's hand landed briefly on his shoulder, an old friend's gesture beneath the professional urgency. Go back to her. She needs you more than she needs another minute of me explaining risk factors. Alessandro returned to find Elena in the grip of another contraction, sweat-soaked and exhausted, and he took her hand and pressed his forehead to hers, murmuring low, steady words that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with love. You're doing so well, he said. You're the strongest person I've ever known, and I've known some genuinely terrifying people. I need you to keep fighting just a little longer, for me and for this baby. It hurts, she gasped, tears mixing with sweat. Alessandro, I'm scared. I know. I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere. He kissed her temple, her cheek, the corner of her mouth, anywhere he could reach while Faro worked. Whatever happens, whatever this baby needs, we're going to handle it together, exactly the way we've handled everything since the storm. 2 more hours passed in a blur of pain and fear and the particular, focused urgency of a medical team working against a clock that had suddenly, terrifyingly sped up. When Faro finally announced with visible relief that the baby's heart rate had stabilized and delivery could proceed naturally, Alessandro felt something in his chest unclench for the first time in what felt like days. The final push, when it came, arrived with a violence and beauty that Alessandro would remember for the rest of his life. Elena's scream giving way suddenly to silence, and then to the thin, furious wail of a newborn finding its voice for the first time, and Faro's voice, thick with relief, announcing a healthy baby girl, small but breathing, strong despite the early arrival. She's beautiful, Elena whispered, exhausted and radiant, as the nurse placed the baby against her chest, tiny and dark-haired and impossibly, perfectly real. Alessandro, look at her. He looked, and something in him that had been braced for violence for 17 straight years finally, completely, laid down its arms. He reached out with one finger, and the baby's small hand curled instinctively around it, and he felt tears he hadn't cried since his father's funeral rise hot and unstoppable. What are we going to call her? He asked, voice rough. Elena considered the question, exhausted joy written across every line of her face. Sophia suggested Grace weeks ago, when we were joking about names. I didn't think much of it then. But now, she looked at the baby, then up at Alessandro, love and gratitude and hard-won peace all tangled together in her expression. Grace Rossi Moretti. I think that's exactly right. A little bit of grace in the middle of everything we've survived to get here. Grace, Alessandro repeated, testing the name against the small, sleeping weight of the daughter he'd claimed, without hesitation, as his own, the moment he'd seen her, biology be damned. Grace Rossi Moretti. I like it. He kissed Elena's forehead, then the baby's, and allowed himself for one long, precious moment to simply feel the impossible, unguarded happiness of a man who had built his whole life around never letting anything close enough to matter this much, and had, in the end, let it happen anyway, and found it was worth every risk that came with it.
The peace lasted exactly 6 hours. Dante Drago came for the child at dawn. He came with more men than he'd brought to the first assault, and this time he came without pretense, without theatre, without the courtesy of an envelope and an orchid. 30 men breaching the estate's perimeter simultaneously from 3 directions. A coordinated assault designed not to intimidate, but to overwhelm. Launched at the exact moment his informants had told him the household would be at its most exhausted and least prepared. Mother and child, fresh from a difficult birth, security stretched thin by hours of medical crisis. Alessandro was in the medical suite when the first alarms sounded, and he was moving before Enzo's voice even finished crackling across the radio, gun in hand, body already positioning itself between Elena's hospital bed and the door. "How many?" he demanded into the radio. "Too many, boss." Enzo's voice was tight with controlled panic, a rare thing from a man who had faced down worse odds than this without flinching. "This isn't a raid. This is an invasion. He's throwing everything he's got. Get every available man to the medical suite, now." Alessandro turned to Elena, pale and exhausted in the hospital bed, the baby cradled against her chest, both of them still fragile from a birth only hours old. "Elena, listen to me. I need you to trust me completely, right now, more than you ever have." "What's happening?" "Dante's here. In force." He said it flatly, without softening it, because she deserved the truth even in the worst of it. "I need to move you and Grace somewhere secure while my men hold this floor." "Can you walk?" "I have to," she said, already struggling upright despite the exhaustion, some fierce maternal instinct overriding the pain of hours-old labor. "I'm not leaving her for anyone, Alessandro. I don't care how tired I am." He helped her up, one arm around her waist, the other keeping his gun trained on the door, and together they moved, slow, too slow, every second an eternity, while gunfire began echoing up through the house below, toward the panic room, hidden behind the library's third bookshelf, the same room he'd tried and failed to reach the first night Dante's men had breached the estate. They didn't make it. 2 of Dante's men appeared at the top of the stairs just as Alessandro and Elena reached the landing, and Alessandro fired before they'd fully registered the threat. 2 shots, both clean, both fatal. But the sound brought 3 more converging from the opposite hallway, and for one horrifying moment, Alessandro understood that he was outnumbered, exposed, and standing between a war and the 2 people he loved most in the world, with nothing but a single weapon and 17 years of training between them and disaster. "Get behind me," he snarled, shoving Elena and the baby into the shelter of an alcove, and turned to meet the new threat with the cold, focused violence that had kept him alive since he was 17 years old. He was good. He had always been good, better than good, the kind of dangerous that men twice his size learn to fear on sight. But 3 against 1, in a hallway with no cover, was a mathematics that even Alessandro Moretti could not entirely defy, and he took a bullet high in the shoulder before he managed to put down the last of them. The pain, a distant, secondary concern,
next to the roaring need to keep Elena and Grace alive. "Alessandro!" Elena's scream cut through the chaos, and he turned to see her staring past him down the hallway, where a fourth figure had emerged from the smoke and gunfire. Dante himself, gun raised, walking toward them with the unhurried confidence of a man who believed, entirely, that he had already won. "You should have given her to me quietly, Moretti," Dante said, gun trained steadily on Alessandro, despite the blood already soaking through his shoulder. "This didn't have to end in a hallway full of bodies." "You had David killed," Elena said, stepping partially out from the alcove despite Alessandro's furious hiss of protest, the baby held tight and protected against her chest, her voice shaking with fury rather than fear. "You've spent months trying to steal a child that was never yours to claim. This ends today, Dante, one way or another." "You're right about that much," Dante said, and something in his eyes had gone past calculation into something closer to madness. A man who had staked everything on a plan now visibly, catastrophically unravelling around him. "It ends today." He raised the gun toward Elena and the baby, and Alessandro moved without thinking, throwing himself into the line of fire with the same instinct that had made him carry a stranger in from a storm 2 months before. Because some decisions weren't decisions at all. They were simply who a person was, revealed in the half-second before everything changed. The gunshot that followed was not Dante's. It came from behind him, from the top of the stairwell, and Dante crumpled without a sound. And standing in the smoke and chaos of the aftermath, gun still raised, face pale and shaking, was Vivian Castellano. The house fell silent in the wake of the gunshot, the remaining Drago soldiers below scattering in the sudden, leaderless chaos of losing their boss, and Enzo's men mopping up what resistance remained with brutal efficiency, now that the head of the invasion had been cut off. Alessandro stared at Vivian, still processing the shape of what had just happened, his shoulder screaming with pain he'd been too focused to fully register until now. "Vivian, what are you—" "I've had eyes on Dante for weeks," Vivian said, lowering the gun with hands that shook only slightly, her composure reasserting itself with visible effort. "After I went to see her," she nodded toward Elena, still frozen against the wall, with Grace clutched protectively to her chest, "I couldn't stop thinking about what she said. That she wasn't fighting me for you, Sandro. That she just loved you, plainly, without any of the games I've spent years playing to try to earn a place at your side. You could have told me you suspected an attack was coming. I didn't know exactly when, only that Dante was moving fast and getting reckless. I've had a man inside his organization for months, an old favor from before you and I ever—" She stopped, shook her head. "It doesn't matter now. When my contact told me Dante was mobilizing at dawn, I came myself. I told myself it was strategy, protecting an ally's interests. But the truth is, I couldn't stand the thought of you dying for her without at least trying to even the odds." Her eyes, when they met Elena's across the ruined hallway, held something raw and complicated, old rivalry burned away by the simple, undeniable fact of a life saved. "I told you I still cared what happened to him. I meant it." "Thank you," Elena said, voice thick with emotion, still shaking with the aftermath of violence and fear and the impossible relief of survival. "Vivian, I don't— Thank you doesn't feel like enough." "It's enough," Vivian said, something almost gentle in her exhausted smile. "Take care of him. And that beautiful girl. She looked down at Dante's body with an expression that held no triumph, only a kind of grim, weary finality. This is over now. Whatever comes next with the Drago organization, succession fights, territory disputes, that's a problem for another day. Today, you're both alive. That's the only thing that matters. Faro arrived moments later, already treating Alessandro's shoulder with brisk, practiced efficiency, while Enzo secured the house and began the grim business of accounting for the dead. Elena sat on the floor of the hallway, unable to move further, cradling Grace and watching Alessandro submit to medical treatment with the same stubborn refusal to leave her side that had defined every hour since the storm first brought them together. "You threw yourself in front of a bullet for us," she said, once Faro had finished bandaging the wound and stepped back to give them a moment. "Alessandro, you could have died." "I would have," he said simply, no drama in it, only fact. Without hesitation. "Elena, I have spent 17 years building a life specifically designed to ensure that nothing could touch me deeply enough to make me vulnerable. And then you and Grace happened, and every careful calculation I ever made stopped mattering the second Dante raised that gun. There was never a version of that moment where I didn't move." "I can't lose you," she said, tears finally breaking free now that the immediate danger had passed. Exhaustion and relief and love all crashing through her at once. "Not now. Not after everything we've survived to get here." "You're not losing me." He pulled her against his good shoulder, careful of the baby between them, and held her while the adrenaline finally drained out of both of them, leaving only the raw, unguarded relief of survival. "Dante's dead. Whatever comes next with his organization, it won't come with the same ferocity. No leader, no unifying claim, nothing left to rally around. We're safe, Elena. Truly safe, for the first time since the night I found you in that storm." "What happens now?" she asked. "To us, to Grace, to all of this?" Alessandro looked down at his daughter, because that was exactly what she was to him now, biology entirely beside the point. Sleeping peacefully against her mother's chest despite the chaos of the last hour, small and impossibly precious, and felt the last of the fear that had gripped him since dawn finally give way to something steadier, something that felt, for the first time in his adult life, like the beginning of peace instead of the aftermath of war. "Now," he said, "we build the life we already started building, back when I thought you were just a stranger the storm brought me. Except this time, we build it without a war hanging over it. Just us. Just Grace. Just whatever we decide to make of all this. Together." "That sounds terrifying," Eleanor admitted, a watery laugh escaping despite everything. "I don't know how to do peace, Alessandro. Not after everything." "Neither do I," he admitted, pressing a kiss to her temple, then to Grace's downy head. "But I'd rather learn it with you than do anything else with anyone else." We'll figure it out. Together. The way we've figured out everything else since the night you fell out of the storm and into my life. The weeks that followed brought a strange, careful quiet to the Moretti estate. The particular quiet of a house exhaling after months of held breath. The Drago organization, exactly as Alessandro predicted, fractured within days of Dante's death, Various lieutenants and cousins scrambling for control of a territory, suddenly without a clear heir. Too fractured and too busy fighting each other to pose any coordinated threat to Chicago. Enzo spent long hours in negotiations with the surviving families up and down the East Coast, quietly, carefully dismantling any lingering claim to the old Rossi contracts, making it clear through channels both formal and otherwise that Elena Rossi's territory, whatever remained of it, was under Moretti protection now, and any further attempt to claim it or her would meet exactly the same response Dante had. Vivian visited twice more in those weeks, each time a little less guarded, a little more willing to sit with Elena on the terrace and talk about things that had nothing to do with Alessandro at all, art mostly, and the particular exhaustion of new motherhood, which Vivian, to Elena's surprise, understood with unexpected tenderness, having raised a niece of her own after her sister's death years before. "I think we could actually be friends," Elena told her during the second visit, watching Vivian hold Grace with the easy confidence of someone who'd done this before, cooing softly at the baby in a way that had nothing to do with the sharp, guarded woman who'd first arrived on the terrace weeks ago. "Don't get sentimental on me," Vivian said, though her smile belied the warning. "I still think you got remarkably lucky, falling into the one man in Chicago capable of surviving what you brought with you." "I know," Elena said. "I think about that every day." "Good," Vivian said. "Never stop. Gratitude keeps a woman sharp. Complacency is what gets people killed in this world." But she said it gently, without the old venom, and when she left that afternoon, she pressed a soft kiss to Grace's forehead and told Elena, quietly, that she was glad, genuinely glad, that things had turned out the way they had. Sophia, for her part, took to her role as unofficial aunt with characteristic enthusiasm, appearing at all hours with gifts and opinions and a steady stream of gossip about the reshuffling underworld politics that Elena, still adjusting to motherhood and the strange new piece of her life, found she had less and less interest in following closely. "You've gone soft," Sophia teased one afternoon, finding Elena in the sunroom, Grace asleep on her chest, both of them bathed in the warm gold light of a late summer afternoon. "A month ago you wanted to understand every detail of this world. Now you can barely be bothered to ask who's fighting whom over Dante's old territory." "I spent my whole life running from this world," Elena said, smiling down at her sleeping daughter. "I think I'm allowed to spend a little time just living in the parts of it that are actually good. The parts with you and Vivian and Enzo pretending he doesn't secretly love babysitting. The parts with Alessandro." "Speaking of," Sophia said, glancing toward the doorway where Alessandro had just appeared, dressed down in a way Elena still wasn't fully used to seeing him, jeans, a soft grey sweater, his usual armour of tailored suits set aside for an afternoon at home. "I'll leave you two." She left, and Alessandro crossed the room to sit beside them, careful of the sleeping baby, pressing a kiss first to Elena's temple and then softly to Grace's small, dark head. "You look happy," he said, studying her with the same careful attention he'd given her since the very first morning, though the wariness that had once underscored it had long since given way to something warmer, steadier. "I am happy," Elena said, and meant it fully, without reservation, for what felt like the first time since she'd woken with no memory in a stranger's bed 2 months before. "It still surprises me, some days, how completely everything changed. I lost David. I lost every memory of the life I had before the storm, for a while.
I lost my father's name and had to learn to carry it again differently than I ever expected to. And somehow, out of all that loss, I ended up here, with you, with her. She looked down at Grace, then up at Alessandro, love and gratitude tangled together in a way she no longer tried to separate or explain. I don't know how to make sense of that. I just know I wouldn't trade it, even knowing everything it cost to get here. Neither would I, Alessandro said quietly. I spent 17 years convinced that love was a liability, Eleanor. A weakness men like me couldn't afford. And then a storm brought you to my door, and I discovered that everything I believed about strength was wrong. Real strength isn't refusing to love anything enough to be hurt by it. It's loving something completely and choosing every day to protect it anyway, knowing exactly what it could cost. That's almost poetic, Elena said, a soft laugh escaping. For a man who claims he doesn't do sentiment. You've ruined me for sentiment, Alessandro said, the ghost of a real smile. Easy now, familiar, nothing like the rare, startling thing it had once been, breaking across his face. I find I don't mind it nearly as much as I expected to. Grace stirred against Elena's chest, small fists opening and closing in her sleep, and Alessandro reached out to still one tiny hand with the tip of his finger, the same gesture he'd made the moment she was born, still awed, still unwilling to take a single second of this unexpected, hard-won peace for granted. They were married in October, on the terrace overlooking the lake, at the exact spot where Elena had first told him, weeks into their careful, dangerous courtship, that she loved him. It was a small affair, by the standards of a family like the Morettis, no grand cathedral, no hundreds of guests representing every family up and down the East Coast, though many of those families sent gifts and careful, respectful acknowledgements of an alliance that had, in the end, secured peace rather than war across half the territories that had once watched Elena's fate with such calculated interest. Instead, there was Sophia, radiant in deep green, serving as Elena's maid of honour with the fierce, protective pride of a woman who had watched this romance grow from its most fragile, uncertain beginning. There was Enzo, standing at Alessandro's side with the quiet gravity of a man who had spent 20 years as his closest friend and had never once expected to see him this unguarded, this completely undone by happiness. There was even Vivian, seated near the front, dressed impeccably, dabbing carefully at her eyes during the vows in a way she would later deny completely. And there was Grace, 5 months old now, dressed in white lace, held in Pharaoh's steady arms during the ceremony itself, before being passed, at the crucial moment, into Elena's arms, so that the small family could stand together as Alessandro spoke his vows. "I told you once," Alessandro said, his voice carrying clear and unwavering across the small, gathered crowd, "that I don't do sentiment, that I built my whole life around never letting anything close enough to be used against me. I want everyone here to understand exactly how wrong I was, and exactly how grateful I am that you didn't listen to a word of it." His eyes held Eleanor's, dark and unguarded, filled with a tenderness that everyone present understood was reserved entirely and completely for her. You fell out of a storm with no name and no memory, and in less time than I ever thought possible, you rebuilt not just yourself, but me. I don't know who I would be without the last 8 months, Eleanor, and I have absolutely no interest in finding out.
I choose you. Not because of a contract our fathers wrote 30 years before either of us understood what love even meant. I choose you because every single day since the storm, you've given me a reason to be the kind of man worth choosing back. I love you. I will spend the rest of my life proving it. Elena, when it came her turn, found her voice shaking with an emotion too large for words, and spoke anyway, because some things deserve to be said even imperfectly. I lost everything the night I fell in your yard, she said. My name, my memories, the man I thought I was going to spend my life with. I woke up in a stranger's house with nothing to hold on to except the baby growing inside me. And I was so afraid, Alessandro. More afraid than I think I've ever let myself fully admit, even to you. And you sat with me through every nightmare. You told me the truth, even when it was ugly. You held space for me to become someone new, instead of demanding I be the woman I used to be before the storm took her from me. You have shown me, every single day since, exactly what it looks like to be chosen. Not out of obligation, not out of contract, but simply because two people found each other in the middle of a war neither of us started and decided deliberately, again and again, to build something better out of the wreckage. I love you. I will spend the rest of my life grateful that the storm brought me exactly where I was always meant to be. The kiss that followed was soft and certain and utterly without the desperate urgency of their earliest stolen moments. The kiss of two people who had survived the worst that could be thrown at them and had chosen, with clear eyes and full memory, to build a life together anyway. Later, as the reception spilled out across the terrace under strings of warm lantern light, Alessandro found Elena standing at the railing, Grace asleep against her shoulder, looking out over the same dark water that had once seemed so full of threat, and now simply seemed, in the golden evening light, beautiful. "Any regrets?" he asked, coming to stand beside her, his arms settling naturally around her waist. "Only one," Elena said, smiling, "that it took a thunderstorm and a head injury to bring us together. Seems like an unnecessarily dramatic way to fall in love." "I don't know," Alessandro said, pressing a kiss to her temple, then to their sleeping daughter's dark hair. "I've always liked storms. They match something in me that never quite settles. But you—" He turned her gently to face him, dark eyes full of a warmth that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who'd known him before the night he carried a stranger in from the rain. "You're the only storm I've ever wanted to stay in forever." Behind them, the lake stretched dark and endless toward a horizon just beginning to catch the last colour of the setting sun, and the house that had once stood as a fortress against the world settled instead into something softer, something that finally, after generations of war and calculation and careful, guarded survival, felt entirely and completely like home.